Welcome to the Politics of Everything. I'm Amber Daines, your host and podcast producer. This is a half hour of power, a podcast dropping every week where I unpack the politics of everything, from money to motherhood, nutrition to narcissism, startups to secularism, the environment, quality, and much, much more. Our guests are seasoned in the field or topic of their choice, even if you've not heard of them yet. This is a non-partisan show. So while I love exploring varied views and get a buzz from a healthy debate of ideas, this is not a purely blue, white, green program. Please subscribe, tune in and enjoy the politics of everything. Today's guest wears a lot of impressive hats. Former Socceroo, broadcaster, adjunct professor, sport and social responsibility, author and human rights activist. Who else could this be but Craig Foster? Following a decorated football career as Australia's 419th Socceroo and 40th captain, Craig has become one of Australia's most respected sports people as a broadcaster, social justice advocate and human rights campaigner. Following his retirement a number of years ago, he quickly became one of Australia's most respected sports broadcasters with an 18-year triple Logie winning career with Australia's multicultural broadcaster, the SBS, as part of the World Game team, which included 5 FIFA World Cups and 4 FIFA Women's Cups, as well as the UEFA Champions League, English Premier League and domestic competitions. Today is a vocal supporter of high humanitarian intake by Australia and particularly an increased intake for Afghan refugees. I have listed a bunch of his accolades on my show notes, but really today I just want to get stuck into our topic, which is the politics of human rights. So welcome, Craig.
Yeah, hi, Amber. How you going?
Excellent. So I'm gonna go back to the soccer stuff because my 2 sons will not forgive me if I don't ask you this. They are mad soccer players, and they're probably the only podcast of mine that they will ever listen to is this one. So there you go. Okay. They are only 9 and 13, so that explains that. So did you always want to be that soccer player as a kid, or was there something else that the young Craig Foster thought that he may do?
I was always involved in concepts of justice even when I was very small. So when I was in teams, like 11, 12, 13, I remember, being very concerned if people weren't treated properly, if they weren't treated fairly, whether that's teammates or other people in my immediate zone. And I was always confident enough to take up those issues, didn't matter what age I was. And then when I was playing, I got involved in a range of issues, particularly Indigenous rights and working on various Indigenous football programs and so on, and getting close to people, getting close to families, learning more, across homelessness and others. And then since I retired and also finished my law degree, then the next iteration just very naturally becomes how that you change policy, how you change public mind, and how you create social change itself.
Absolutely. So for lots of people, and this is very well documented, leaving elite sport, it can often be a hard transition to normal life. It sounds like you had your plan B kind of sorted and you went on to study and you've obviously been able to recreate and have a second career. But do you remember the moment that you retired and what those next few days, months and years felt like as you found a new purpose? Because it's very different, I guess, the regimented life of a professional sports person to, I guess, a civilian, if you like.
Yeah, I had a different transition to most. I was already involved, for example, in the Republic movement when I was just still a Socceroo. So I was politically active. I was involved in a whole range of issues, including a bit obliquely refugees and others. So that was very natural. It just meant that I had more time and I moved into broadcasting. So that was a very smooth transition. I'd been throughout my career in Australia and at some points in Asia, because I could kind of articulate myself okay on the various interviews that I was asked to do. From time to time, television stations would say, look, do you want to come and do something? Can you do? So I did a little bit of TV in Asia. And then when I was in Adelaide, also for Channel 10, I was still playing. And therefore, by the time I was like around early 30s and my body was failing, SBS asked me to then come and work with them on the FIFA World Cup in 2002. Which was a tremendous experience. And then after that, they said, look, can you stay? It's gone so well. They had huge ratings and they wanted to then open up into some greater, longer shows and more content. And I said, oh, that's perfect timing. So I was very fortunate in that way. I just kind of stepped straight from the field. As I took the boot off, I grabbed the microphone and the two were very synchronous. It just meant that I could talk about the game that I just spent all that time in. That my skills that I developed as a player and the understanding, suited perfectly that on-air role. So it was a pretty simple transition.
Excellent. So, getting into our topic today, how do you define human rights? And is there sort of a practical example of what it is in practice? Because some people, it might think it's just about having the equality of opportunity no matter who you are and where you're from. In a legal and moral sense, is it more than that in your experience?
Well, human rights are really simple, actually. So the answer is it is more in content and breadth, but they're really simple. What happened essentially after the Second World War, when literally millions of humans died, and we had various atom bombs and other things, and we saw death, or people at that time saw death on a grander scale than they had in their lifetimes or throughout history. Therefore, they said, look, we need to do something about this. We need to have some type of rules of engagement as to how humans across countries, across religions, across all of these boundaries, about how we engage with each other. What are the minimum requirements for each of us to treat each other, what we would say in a humane way, as another human? And then what are the minimum things that humans actually should have? What should we think that every person in the world, what are the basic items that they require to live a life of dignity and opportunity? So it's really that simple. So it starts with shelter, food, and the right to education, for example. So,
So is that like the UN Convention of Human Rights sort of definition? Is that where we're coming from? Okay.
Yeah, so what happened is there was what was called a League of Nations, and after the Second World War, they formed the United Nations, which now has over 200 member countries of the world, so the vast majority. And they came together and created the first universal declaration on what they called human rights at that time. It was groundbreaking. I think there were around 14 people on that committee from memory. It was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt of the United States, and it had representatives, including from Australia. It had representatives across the geographic span of the globe, but also across religion as well. There were Arabic representatives, there were Muslim representatives. That's really important. So, all of a number of religions came to that table, and so many countries came to that table, and they decided, let's try and create now, if you can imagine, put it this way, prior to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was the start of it all, basically what you would say, and you use the terms moral and ethical manner of treating each other, largely came out of religion. And therefore, do unto others as you do unto yourself in Christianity, or, whatever is the case for other religions, Buddhist and others. And throughout antiquity, humans saw that as, the religious principles as their guidebook on how to treat other people. But of course, many of the wars throughout human history have been fought on religious grounds and religious differences.
And they still are.
Still are.
Yeah,
Still are,
absolutely.
right? So religion is something that very often divides people very passionately, very strongly, and even aggressively. So what the world rightly said was, well, we need to move away from that and just have some human rules. So these aren't divine. These are not ordained by a God. These are the rules that we agree as the League of Nations, as the countries of humanity. We're going to agree to this whole declaration and these principles as to how we're going to deal with each other now. And the reason we're doing that is to try and create greater peace, try and minimize conflict and war in future, and to uplift humans everywhere. Let's talk about the basics that they need. So that's where it came from. That's why I happen to think it's quite brilliant. It's contested. You can disagree with some of them, and of course, many religions do. For instance, gender equality and the right to girls' education is one of the basic human rights I believe in very strongly. Well, many religions don't. So what I see human rights is as a really safe space in the center of humanity, and religion can revolve around that. But this core area of human life that we all agree that this is the way we should treat each other, I think actually is the most important.
Absolutely. I think you've summarised that that really well and kind of unpacked it, I guess, at the same time. So what prompted you to become a sort of a really public human rights advocate? You talk about your early experiences and always having a sense of justice and I guess helping different communities, particularly when you're involved in soccer. Was there a trigger for you that made this be your kind of focus? And I guess what keeps you going, the second part to this, because issues like the Manus Island detainee cases, for example, just feel like in Australia they'll never go away. So how do you keep the momentum?
Yeah, so to the first point, I was always involved in these issues. For instance, I was the CEO and later chairperson of our Players Association in football. And some years ago, I helped the organisation and the executive to change the constitution to bring women on board for the first time on the executive. That's basically the Socceroos and Matildas now working together, equal representation on the board. And what we saw from that is that the conversations change, that women's football becomes much more important within the organisation, and they go on to fight for equal pay. And today, only a couple of years ago, they achieved that with the full support of the Socceroos. So I was involved in that's gender equality, for example, right? So,
Yes.
and equity, we would say gender equity means not just equality, but actually also righting wrongs and bringing people up to speed rather than just saying, well, you guys are way behind, but you can now just have the same rights as we have. Equities goes further and says, well, no, it's like Indigenous Australia. Just creating the same laws for Indigenous Australians does not undo all the disadvantage that's been there for 230 years. And therefore, we need to atone and account for that. So we have to do more. We have to provide more opportunities. That's called equity. So I've always been involved in it. What I guess the main trigger was I started to work with both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty as a bit of an ambassador. I got to understand the issues more, many of which aren't in all, it's not in the front of Australians. It's not really a huge part of our culture, something I want to change. Therefore, many Australians, aren't really sure what human rights are. It sounds very legalistic. It actually is international law, so it tends to be the domain of lawyers. And then, of course, I started and then studied human rights throughout my law degree, and that was important because I then had a better understanding of the international framework. I understood the conventions, the declarations. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples all around the world, for example, was very important for me because I realised that Indigenous Australians have the same rights as Canadian Indians and Brazilian Indigenous people under international law, and all of these. They have various names, from protocols to conventions to declarations, but basically they are just documents written into international law under the United Nations that countries become a signatory to. So Australia is a member of the United Nations, and therefore we are asked to sign up to the new convention, which, for instance, at the moment is on climate action, has just become a human right, the right to a livable planet, which I think is good, right?
Absolutely. It's one of the big pillars I think we all have to focus on.
Exactly. So what happens? Australia then is asked to sign up to these conventions. Now, because Australia is a dualist legal system, that means when we sign an international convention or even a treaty with another country or these types of things, they don't necessarily have to be implemented in Australian law. We have domestic legislation, which can be very different. So when, for instance, anti-discrimination legislation was brought in, back in, I think it was the 70s, that was off the back of international instruments and a global drive for non-discrimination. It was very important. When it comes to refugees, for example, Australia is a signatory to the Refugee Convention back in 1951, but we then legislate most of those things away in our local Immigration Act simply because of politics. Politicians start to lobby to take away some of the rights of refugees they have under international law. So it was a collection of things. And then a couple of years ago, I kind of got a bit of a turbocharge because I ran off to Bangkok to go and help this young Bahraini kid. And I had to meet with the UN. I had to meet with a range of countries. I had to secure the support of many organisations around the world. And in so doing, they all kind of became part of my network of change now. And so I'm connected into the global human rights network, which gives me far greater access and opportunity to make, or to support and try to make change here and abroad.
Absolutely. So many of us did witness that sort of constant media coverage that your role in freeing footballer Hakeem El Arabi in 2019 actually produced. And it was a bit of a relentless campaign, I imagine. And you had to pull on every lever you had to keep that case front of mind because, you know, the news cycle moves on and people aren't always interested in small developments. They want to know the big developments. But reflecting on that experience, what did that reveal to you about the reality of perhaps Australia's human rights approach?
Yeah, so I met many embassies and delegates from different countries around the world when I was in Bangkok and when I was trying to help Hakim Al Arabi. And it became very evident in speaking to them that there was a blockage in getting their support for Hakim. So I needed all these countries in Bangkok to turn up in the court, at the court case, to make statements, to lobby behind the scenes, to lobby diplomatically the Thai government, you know, to let them know, for example, that the German delegation in Thailand is not happy about the way that they're treating this refugee because international refugee passage, safe passage and travel around the world is very important to every country. And therefore, you know, Thailand were blocking and really trampling on one of the key concepts of the Refugee Convention. So I was asking them for support, and it was a very important case in that regard. You know, as a kid who had gone to another country and all of a sudden, you know, he was trying to be a refoulement, which meant Bahrain, from where he fled and was given refuge in Australia, legally that is, he was made a refugee. They were then trying to bring him back to Bahrain, and that's against international law.
Absolutely.
Clearly, someone who's been tortured or persecuted and left somewhere and then is given refuge in another country, you can't send them back to the first country. Obviously, they're going to be harmed. So I was saying to all these countries, listen, you know, we really need your help. Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, others, and the EU itself, who have an office in Bangkok. And they were kind of in guarded language, kind of just more or less saying to me, look, it's, you know, we'd love to help, but you know, you guys have got a horrible record on refugees. So, you know, you're an Australian here asking us for our support. And we've been trying to ask your government to stop torturing refugees for some time through the UN.
Mm.
So I went to see the UN and you know, basically the same message was coming from a range of their organisations. And I said to them, look, give me your support and I commit to you that when I get back home, I'm going to raise the issue around Manus Nauru and others and our policy, and I'll spend time, I'll commit myself to trying to change that because it's important not just for Australia but for the world. Right? Any country who, you know, treads on these international treaties, it puts the whole framework at risk. All of a sudden, if we won't take people, well, then who's going to take them? And then USA have to step up, contrary to the international legal framework. All of a sudden, the UNHCR, which is the High Commission for Refugees, they have to say to US, look, we know that Australia should be taking them. We get that. That's what we all signed up to. But they won't take them. So we're just asking you, can you please take another 1,000 or 1,200 as it was? Or New Zealand, look, guys, we know that you have your own commitments and, you know, Australia is much bigger, got much more land and should be doing more, but they're not. They won't do it. And therefore, could you please take some? Or France or Switzerland? This is what happened. So I said to them, I'll go home and I will try and change this and get us back on track to what I would say is sane, humane policy. So that's basically that was the message that was coming from around the world, and rightly so. You know, the world is looking at us now and going, you guys have completely lost your heads. I mean, what are you actually doing? You've kept people locked up for 9 years. That's just crazy.
Absolutely, I agree. And I suppose it sounds like it's quite relentless in terms of being able to keep that. Like you say, the political cycle might change. We may have new governments, you know, and new parties in charge. But I guess that policy itself doesn't sound like it's moving that much. I mean, in practice, in the reality of what happens.
No, there has been kind of circuit breakers with Medevac legislation and other things, but Australia's been stuck here for a long time for a number of reasons. But when you talk about motivation, you know, I know the people. So once I get to know the people, then I feel strongly enough about it, you know, that I just won't stop. But there's no point to stop. So I get energized by doing it. It's not as though I get fatigued because it's really difficult. No, I see it just as important, and I'm more than happy to do it. But secondly, I also see that it's important to Australia. So, you know, I don't advocate for refugees just because I want to see these people free, and that's absolutely true and very important. But I also think that it's one of the most important issues facing Australia at this moment in time because, you know, we can, if we can as a people, as a country, look away from the torture of innocent refugees for 9 years and in fact not even on Manus and Nauru, but now locked up in the Park Hotel in Melbourne and Brisbane and
Which
elsewhere.
only came to fame because of a certain tennis star recently.
That's right. And so, people used to think, oh, well, it was offshore, so therefore Australians don't know
Out of
about
sight,
it.
out of mind almost.
Yeah. So now it's here, and yet still we're not moving. And now Novak Djokovic got detained and thrown in the same hotel as 33 refugees who are in their ninth year. And now Australians can't say at least they don't know about it. But the question is, are we moving? What are we doing? So I just see it as really important to our national psyche, our culture. I think that a country should be measured by the way that it treats its vulnerable, not by the way it treats me as a privileged person. And there's few more vulnerable than refugees, who by definition have to throw themselves on the mercy of a different country that they don't know, often don't speak the language, and often they travel with nothing but the clothes on their back.
Absolutely. So we also have a problematic human rights record in Australia when it comes to our First Nations people who have suffered and continue to suffer. And some ABS figures, metrics around this from last year show that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander prisoners make up 30% of all prisoners in custody, and 78% have experienced prior adult imprisonment. Life expectancy also is much lower than non-Indigenous Australians. How can we really rectify this relentless state of despair, if you like, and in a way that's humane, but actually is something that perhaps works collaboratively with First Nations people rather than us sort of dictating what that looks like?
Yeah, the first answer is to tell the truth. And so you notice those who don't want Indigenous advancement constantly are talking about the national educational curriculum. And it's very important, if you don't want change, to maintain hegemony, maintain control of what children learn. So they always say that history is written by the victor. Well, in this case, by the colonizer. And what that means is, and I'm a white Australian who is descended from England and came on the boats, ironically, given that I'm a refugee advocate, might be one of the reasons why, and so people who control the curriculum, which is usually the government of the day, well, it's always the government of the day, are under pressure from various lobby groups all around the country to change language, change the view of certain historic events and so on. That's incredibly important. And we're still having that, if you like, wrestling match. I would say debate, but it's more a wrestling match today. And there was only in recent days news about Alan Tudge, who's the education minister, doesn't want, some of the language that's in the current curriculum or that was proposed. Now, so what you teach the next generation, and all of us, in fact, the language you use on television, the way that you report in the popular media, these things are all incredibly important, because we ultimately, not many people have time to sit around and read all the books in antiquity. So they generally form their view from, what they digest, whether from the popular media or, sadly today, from Facebook and YouTube and other things, right?
Absolutely.
Which obviously carries, even worse, a lot of misinformation and inaccuracies. So that's important. And so by that, I mean, tell the truth. So if there was atrocities, massacres, frontier violence, then that's important. We have to know that, because until we resile with what actually happened, then we can never understand where we really came from. I don't understand the reticence, the fear for doing that. I do know that there are sections of society who control power and would be perfectly willing to let Indigenous Australia stay in the largely disadvantaged position they're in, and therefore it suits them to keep the language and keep history as it is. I happen to
Absolutely.
think, that we just need to go to the truth. I'm certainly not challenged by it, in the sense that I want to know, and that we need to account for that. And then secondly, and this is where human rights come in, so Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, have the right to self-determination. And what that means is that they have the right to organise themselves and to be involved in all decisions that pertain to them. Okay, that's really important. So some Australians will say, well, we give all of this money to Indigenous Australia, over all these years, billions of dollars. And what I would say is no. Overwhelmingly, what we do is give billions of dollars to ourselves to administer on programs that we design for Indigenous Australia. That's very different to having Indigenous-led organisations where that have autonomy, that have decision-making power, and this is where the voice to Parliament comes in. So, voice treaty truth. So for Indigenous Australia, it's about telling the truth about what happened, and then having a Makarrata Commission. This is all under the Uluru Statement, which is a very, very important document. And the Makarrata Commission means a commission that is about, firstly, truth-telling and also voice to Parliament. That means whenever laws being formed, changed, debated that affect Indigenous Australia, they must be at the table. And that is a basic human right of Indigenous peoples. Why is it necessary for that right to be there? Well, simply because they have been oppressed. There's been genocide in many countries around the world. Probably the majority certainly the majority that were colonised and invaded, where Indigenous peoples were, the incumbent, a social cultural group. And Australia's part of that. What happened with Indigenous Australia is certainly cultural genocide. And in places like Tasmania, for example, there was an official attempt to wipe out Aboriginals in Tasmania.
Yes. So that's just something we can't deny. It has to be acknowledged
Yeah.
and addressed and rectified.
Well, I agree. I mean, I just think it's really simple. But first we need to know about it. So, Australia has, had politicians and governments that have pushed back, and media that's pushed back against this for a very, very, very long time. I mean, years ago, I used to go to the Invasion Day marches in Redfern with, Indigenous Australia. And, it was still a protest march, but we've come a long way to the sense that this year in 2022, the Australia Day was very, very different. The term Invasion Day has now been accepted. It's no longer, a kind of pejorative term. It's not, people aren't getting upset about it. It's just now become part of the vernacular. That's important. NITV was simulcasting on Channel 10 network on the morning of what's still called Australia Day, but talking about genocide. They were talking about dispossession, talking about stolen generation. These discussions, even 10 years ago, were highly charged, highly contentious and confronting to many people in Australia, and they're not anymore. So it does show you that social change does happen. It's too slow, but we're certainly making some headway anyway when it comes to these issues.
I would imagine that you're a mentor to lots of people, but I always believe no one's got to where they are without some other people helping them. Would you have one or two mentors that you'd like to shout out to, and why do they make such an impact in your life and career?
Well, I just like to, there's many, many, many. And so I'm not sure I would say mentors, but just people who I rely on. I just believe that we are, as you say, we are not individuals. I think when COVID hit, people got the first sense for many decades that, we are a communal being, we are a communal animal species. That's why we live in societies. That's why, we live in communities. And we have to bring back this sense of shared solidarity. And so I just, surround myself with the most brilliant people, much more brilliant than I.
That's the trick, I reckon, just having people around you that, build you up, lift you up, inspire you, and make it all worthwhile.
Well, I try to lift them up. I just try and help them, do the best job they can do and provide whatever, tools I have to help them do their stuff. So, and, just good people. That's all.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter who they are. If I don't think they're a good human, if I don't think that their heart's in the right place, that they're going to actually help others and do things for the right reason, I don't care how powerful they are, how much money they are, what titles they have. I just don't spend any time for them, and that's why I live my life.
Absolutely. If we spoke again in a year, what would be the number one thing that you hope you would have changed based on what you do today?
Well, I'd like to get this refugee issue over the hill.
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
That was it. That was a no-brainer, I think.
Just get everyone out, firstly, and then secondly, we need to start talking about a better policy. But the first thing is just unchain everyone and get them out. Like, that's got to happen. I'm sure it will, but it has to happen in 2022. These people can't go on to 10 years. That's just well beyond.
Absolutely. A final takeaway message for us today on the politics of human rights.
Human rights are just everyday things that we often take for granted, but many people around the world don't have them. So, we've got girls go to school as a matter of course in Australia. Whereas, for instance, the Taliban just invaded Afghanistan, and so all the girls there, they no longer have that ability. It's a right. That's what you call a human right, to be educated. Plenty of people around the world don't have food. We see still a tremendous amount of poverty and famines from time to time, particularly during conflict and drought. That's a basic human right, just to be able to fill your stomach every day. People are still homeless in Australia, even in a very wealthy Western society. We still have, I think, around 165,000 in 2021 people without a roof over their head, sleeping rough, whether in cars or under bridges. Well, just having shelter over your head is a human right. And I saw a leading social commentator recently say, oh, look, if you elect these people, you should be aware that billionaires are going to be taxed and childcare will be free. And also, there'll be social housing. Well, social housing means that everyone has the right to simply be in a safe, sheltered environment.
Absolutely.
No human being should ever argue against that. So whilst that commentator was using it as kind of, some type of attempted negative, I responded and said, that just sounds fabulous. So many people in the world don't have what we have. It's important that we recognize that and that we try and support them in their endeavors to get it. But I guess in the end, human rights are neutral. So you can have religious views, and many people do in Australia. We have religious freedom, which is incredibly important. Our government is not religious per se, like Iran, for example, or parts of the Middle East. We are secular, which means that the rule of law is what we abide by, and you can have your own religious views, but human rights sit in the middle. And as far as I'm concerned, they are immutable, they are universal, and no religion should touch them. And that means that every human being should be treated with dignity, that no one should be tortured, including refugees, that everyone should have enough to eat, that women should be able to work, study, and do anything that men are able to do. And that's the way the world should be.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully it's not too far away. Thank you so much for your time, Craig. And if you do want to contact Craig Foster and find out a little bit more about him, there will be some details on the show notes. Until next time, take care. Thanks so much for listening today. If you've enjoyed the politics of everything, I thrive on your feedback. So please add a short review and share the podcast with your network through Apple, Spotify, and all the usual suspects. I'm always on the hunt for new and diverse guests, so if you or someone you know has a fresh idea you're busting to get out there, please email me at amber@amberdanes.com and my crew will get back to you very soon.